and targeting and just all the many ways in which carceral logics happen in our everyday lives and how we resist them. There's so much to learn from each other as we're organizing in different spaces, in different contexts, and particularly around the issue of policing gangs, policing like immigration enforcement and racial profiling. There's so many instances in today's political discourse that tries to pit like Black and Latinx folks against each other, for example, or just so many disconnects and silos between these issues, and really there's so much interconnection happening, right? And so what we want to do tonight is highlight some of those connections, do some of that political filtering, and really question and be critical of how we're organizing through an abolitionist lens, or really staying true to that practice. So if you were at our kickoff event on Wednesday, then you have a pretty good conception of what abolition is. But if you weren't, we'll talk about it throughout the evening, but just at the most basic level, abolition is a praxis, this idea that there are other solutions to resolving conflict, to dealing with our everyday social, economic, and political problems that do not involve prisons, jails, policing, surveillance, and other punitive systems of social control, right? There are other ways that we can relate to each other, to hold each other accountable. So it's both a project of dismantling and building, right? And so part of why we called this event Beyond One Chicago is kind of a critique and a little shade to the city campaign, this One Chicago city campaign that's like, you know, Chicago is a city of immigrants and everybody's welcome here. It's political grandstanding, right? It's empty rhetoric because this is the same city where many immigrants, undocumented or not, refugees are criminalized and profiled and surveilled and targeted in ways that isn't welcoming at all. And so what we want to do is highlight those things and really get into a critical conversation amongst each other as speakers, but also with you all. So another purpose of this event, if you don't have it by now, is to discuss at least a little bit this preliminary report called Tracked and Targeted about early findings of Chicago's gang database. That, I guess we can call this a soft launch, so to speak, but a working document because we want to have a dialogue about the things that we have found, the problems that we do know about Chicago's gang database, and really invite you all to think critically with us about what does it mean to move forward and have critical next steps that don't set us back. What do non-reformist reformers look like in dismantling and making the Chicago's gang database obsolete, right? So I'm gonna start with just some basic overviews and findings from the research that we've done, and we're gonna get into a panel conversation about just each other's work, some of the lessons learned, and then we're gonna go into breakouts to get into some deeper conversation with each other and come back. Yeah.
Well, Janae said most of the things, so I'm going to keep it really short. So yes, whether or not folks know, Critical Resistance is a national organization that's been working to abolish the prison industrial complex for almost 20 years. Look out in 2018 for our 20-year celebration. And we have chapters in New York and Oakland and LA and Portland, and then there are at-large people like myself. I live in Atlanta, but I came all the way out here to chop it up with y'all today. And we do a lot of work on the ground with our chapters to think about what the prison industrial complex looks like where we're at. So in some spaces, that's fighting local jails, jail and prison expansion. In other places, that looks like fighting gang injunctions, and supporting political prisoners in fighting against solitary confinement. It can look like a wide variety of things. So in addition to us throwing down and doing that work, we know it's really important to build connections, to build shared understandings of what the prison industrial complex looks like, and to also share the lessons learned around how we fight and how we win. And so we know that in Chicago, folks have been throwing the fuck down. And so we are really excited to come out here and connect with folks to get a clear understanding of what the prison industrial complex, and right now, especially with policing and immigration, increased gang policing, and the ways that all of the different stuff coming from the Trump administration is impacting Black and brown folks here in Chicago, and then to also talk about how we can fight it, how we can support y'all in fighting it, and how we're gonna see y'all win. And so we're excited to be here today to be building and connecting with y'all and to dive deep into some of the information and research that folks have been doing here, and to also share some of our lessons learned. So thanks everybody for coming out.
So before we bring other folks up here, I just want to tell y'all a little bit about the research that has been going on around the gang database and the campaign that this research is, why this research is supporting social movements. So in addition to being a member of UIP 100, I'm also a third-year PhD student here at UIC. And I want to shout out Andy Clarno, who I got this announcement about this class, this social justice ethnography class that was focused on policing in Chicago. I'm like, what? That sounds dope as hell. So I signed up, and this class turned out to be a mechanism between students and faculty in direct conversation with social movement organizations that are resisting police violence and policing in Chicago, and really trying to bring together different silos of organizing together. And so this Policing in Chicago research group at UIC has been working closely with Organized Communities Against Deportations, BYP 100, and the Arab American Action Network on issues related to fusion centers that I'll talk about in a second, and the Chicago's gang database. Just a little bit of context, at the beginning of this year, BYP 100, OCAD, and Mi Gente launched a campaign called the Expanded Sanctuary Campaign, Defy, Defend, Expand Sanctuary, that is really challenging this sanctuary cities notion. When Trump was elected, there's all this backlash to sanctuary cities, or cities that vow to protect undocumented immigrants against federal enforcement, saying that local police won't cooperate with ICE, et cetera, et cetera. And Chicago is, on paper, a sanctuary city, but in actuality, there are carve-outs or loopholes in Chicago sanctuary city policies that say, yeah, we're a welcoming city to the good immigrants, but those immigrants who have a felony conviction, those immigrants who are gang affiliated, those immigrants who just are criminal, are not welcome here, right? We will hand them over to ICE, right? That makes sanctuary a misnomer. But also, we can't talk about being a sanctuary city. We can't talk about police collaboration with ICE and that criminalization without talking about or putting into context the everyday policing and criminalization that also happens against U.S. born folks, right? And the connections between immigration enforcement and local law enforcement as both like a funnel into mass deportation and mass incarceration. That albeit impacts U.S. born folks and undocumented folks differently, there's also a lot of connections, right? And so what we wanted to do was create a narrative and shared solidarity with our feet beyond just solidarity with as a buzzword, to say, okay, we're going to work together to defy and defend and resist criminalization, racial profiling, and really try to recreate what sanctuary really means in Chicago. So that being said, the 4 initial demands that launched this campaign included to end the collaboration between immigration enforcement and local law enforcement, eliminating all the carve-outs in Chicago sanctuary city policy. 2, to eliminate the use of the gang database, or the system of tracking people's alleged gang affiliation as a means to target and surveil them and criminalize them. And also to divest from policing, from systems, punitive systems, and reinvest those resources into our communities. There's so many resources that's being harbored. We can just collectively call it the prison industrial complex, but if we just think about police by itself in Chicago getting 39% of the city's budget, that increased to $4 million a day. Imagine what you can do with those funds if we think about this, the neighborhoods and the cities that across the country that has the highest levels of violence, that makes Chicago, this infamous place where that justifies having these gang databases and mechanisms of criminalization. If we had jobs instead, if we had mental health centers and all these other things, then maybe our city would look different. So we did this research to say, we know that this is happening anecdotally, but there's not really a lot of information about how this database operates. What is the criteria? How do you get on it? How does CPD determine that you're a gang member or not? And so through a combination of interviews with people who've been directly impacted, members of CPD themselves, gang researchers, legal support groups like civil rights attorneys, police misconduct attorneys, also submitted some FOIA requests. Some of them have been answered, some of them haven't, and just archival research to really try to put pieces of a puzzle together to figure out how is this actually operating in the city. And so we found a few things, and there's some things that we still have yet to know. So just a little gang database 101. What is Chicago's gang database? Well, for one thing, it's not just a whole standalone database by itself. We're in an era of big data, right? Where, law enforcement agencies share information with each other. And so Chicago's CLEAR system stands for Citizen and Law Enforcement and Analysis Reporting System. It's this huge, like the Hail Mary of surveillance information systems, wherein there's many different databases within that one system, right? And so anytime an officer does what's called an investigatory stop, or folks can just call it stop and frisk, that's what it is, of an alleged gang member, they'll fill out a gang arrest card and deem that person as gang affiliated. Well, how do they do that? That's determined by one self-admission. So someone will admit to, and there's many problems with that. Anybody think of what might be an issue with someone self-admitting as being in a gang? It's like that being criteria to include them in the database. It's incriminating, yes. Yes. Is it always true? No. We know that CPD has somewhat of a track record in coercing people to say things that aren't true. Or there's just so many other factors that can go into why someone might admit to being in a gang if they aren't. The way, the clothes that people wear, the people that people hang around with. So you can be tagged as being gang affiliated and not be in a gang at all, but your brother is, or your cousin is, or your uncle is, or somebody in your friend or family affiliate circle. There are indicators of, if a gang specialist within CPD testifies that you're a gang member, well, how do they know, right? What makes someone a gang specialist? Because they have years in the field, so they can tell you, well, they wear these colors and they hang out on that block, that's that territory, so they got to be, that gang, they got to be GD or Blackstones or whatever. And also, they rely on testimony or corroboration just from other witnesses who've, quote, been reliable to law enforcement in the past. So basically, confidential informants who knows what ulterior motives or how reliable or whatever their information is, but that is still used as, a way to get you as labeled as a gang member in this database. So what are some of the consequences? Now that you have this label, what does that mean for your everyday life? People who are listed on the database are subject to even more harassment. So we all know what it's like to be, a person of color, to live in a black or a brown body, just period. But add to that, you have this label where police officers have technology at the tips of their fingers, literally in their squad cars or whatever. They can look you up, say, oh, this person is a whatever, a part of whatever gang, right, that is a means for increased harassment. We've heard many different stories through our interviews, through stories of organizers throughout this campaign, of police officers just seeing a group of people, calling themselves enforcing the gang loitering ordinance, stop a group of people, tell everybody to take out their IDs, say, everybody's going to jail. I've had an interviewee say that they've had to pay a police officer to not go to jail, right? Just systematic harassment based on these labels. You have people who, if they're applying for a job or housing, that just does background checks where there's some information sharing happening that has been a barrier to obtaining some certain types of licenses, like child care licenses or other professional licenses that would bar you from having some type of gang affiliation status. If you're an immigrant, alleged gang affiliation is the primary thing that puts a target on your back for the Department of Homeland Security. And so, speaking of other agencies, I wanted to bring Andy up here. He's on the phone, but Andy has been spearheading the research group at UIC, and we just learned a lot of different interconnections between how information is shared. He's on the phone right now, so I'm just going to say that one of the ways that we found some interconnections between, like, immigration policing and, say, the surveillance of Arab and Muslim groups are like these fusion centers. So all of the information, actually I don't even have to. Here you go, Andy. Can you tell us about information sharing?
Hi everyone, sorry about that. The fire department's at my house right now. Everything's cool. But my baby's, it's okay. So, yeah, Janae told y'all all about the gang database. I was going to talk about how that gang database is situated in some broader approaches to policing and what the Chicago Police Department is doing, and then what they do with that data and the way they share it with federal agencies. So predictive policing is the overall approach that the Chicago Police Department uses. And then what that means is that they're using all kinds of advanced surveillance technology, data collection, data analysis software to try to predict where they think crime is about to take place and who they expect is going to be involved, right? So they have things like, obviously, all the red light cameras, all the surveillance cameras that are around, license plate recognition. They have these Stingray devices which can monitor and record information that's on your cell phones. They have all kinds of GIS, like geographical mapping technologies. They have social media monitoring technologies. They've got something called Shot Spotter. As soon as a gunshot goes off in a particular area, their idea is that all of this stuff will be linked together, right? So they've got these audio devices that are going to monitor if a shot goes off in an area. What they wanted to do is then trip the social media monitoring stuff to be able to monitor everybody's social media in that site, in that area, to know, like, is anybody talking about what just happened? So they're doing all of this stuff, right? For a long time, they've used what they call hotspot or geographical predictive policing, where they try to figure out where are the hotspots, where things are going to go, and use that to deploy their officers. But for the last 4 years, they've been also, in addition to that, doing something called individual predictive policing, using something that's called the strategic subjects list, or the hot list. Right? The strategic subjects list is this calculus, this algorithm that they use, where supposedly it's going to allow the police department to predict who is most likely to be involved in a shooting, either as a shooter or as a victim in the coming days, right, or coming weeks. And all of this, what happens is they assign everybody a number from 1 to 500. And that information is based on your individual arrest and victimization history, as well as your network of known and suspected affiliates and their arrest records. Right? So people with a higher number, 500, are most likely, according to the police, to be involved in coming weeks in some sort of a shooting. But it's important to recognize that all of this information is based on your arrest records and the arrest records of people that you know. Right? So what it does is it creates a mathematical justification for doing more of what they're already doing, which is over-policing particular neighborhoods and particular populations. But the thing about this strategic subjects list, there's 400,000 people in the city of Chicago on the strategic subjects list. More than 250,000 of them are considered priority type targets. Out of that 250,000, 57% of those people have never been arrested for any of the key things that they're concerned about, which is gun violence, violent offenses, the unlawful use of a gun, or narcotics. So where did that come from? That came from the fact that they're just justifying the practices that they're already doing. The other thing about this list is that 65,000 people on the strategic subject list supposedly have a gang affiliation. So the CPD doesn't release information about its gang database, but that's the best we have to go on. 65,000 people supposedly are gang affiliated in the city of Chicago. I don't know if you gave us some of the numbers that we have, but it's in that report. There's numbers in that report. They're staggering. In certain neighborhoods, up to 75% of black men under the age of 30 are on this heat list, are on the strategic subjects list. And gang affiliation, up until recently, was part of the way that they determine who is supposedly most likely to be involved in violence. So they use that to then continue intensifying the targeting of the populations in the neighborhoods that they're already targeting. The other thing that I want to talk about, though, is what happens to all of this data. So they're collecting all this data in the CLEAR database, they've got their gang database, they've got their SSL. What happens to all that information? It doesn't just stay with the Chicago Police Department. They share all of this stuff with federal and state law enforcement agencies, right? There's a very important center called CPIC. How many people have heard of CPIC? It's the Chicago Police Department's Crime Prevention and Information Center. It's located in CPD headquarters. And it's what's called a fusion center. After 9/11, the federal government created funding for something called fusion centers because they said one of the things they wanted to do is to encourage local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies to share information with one another. Right? So they started to put money to create a whole network of fusion centers. In every state, there's a fusion center, and in every major metropolitan region, there's a fusion center. And their whole existence is about sharing information and sharing data between local, state, and federal agencies, right? So these things started out with a focus on terrorism, or suspected terrorism. That was the whole idea behind it, and so that's where they started putting money forward. But what happened is that, especially in cities like Chicago, the police department said, well, we've got other things that we're concerned about, and so let's use all that money and that technology to not just focus on questions of terrorism, but all kinds of violent crime. And so this is one of the places where you start to see the actual intersections between the criminalization and death of black youth, the deportation of Latinx communities, and the surveillance and harassment of Arab and Muslim communities, because a tremendous amount of money coming in from the federal government to the Chicago police in order to do surveillance on Arab and Muslim communities or suspected terrorists, but then the police department turns around and uses all of that technology to surveil and monitor communities of color and insurgent communities throughout the city. So they said, we're not just going to focus on terrorism, we're going to focus on all kinds of violent crime. CPIC, this center, started off as an intelligence data analysis center within the department headquarters. It quickly became, though, the center that manages all of the surveillance technology, all of the intelligence, and much of the operations for the entire Chicago Police Department. They manage all of the databases, the CLEAR database, the gang database. They manage all of that software, all of the surveillance technology is being managed and run out of CPIC.
Which is expensive.
It's expensive, and they're getting federal funding for all of this stuff, right? And the thing about this is that because it's a fusion center, what that means is that the FBI has a desk there. DEA has a desk there, ICE has a desk there, the Department of Homeland Security has a desk there. All of them have agents staffed at this office in the Chicago Police Department headquarters, which is the center of all the intelligence and surveillance that's happening in the city. they're all there together in the same room, right? The other thing, though, is that that's not the only way that the Chicago Police Department shares its information with federal agencies. There are other databases now, mostly run by the FBI. There's something called the National Data Exchange Platform, where the CPD uploads its database into this federal database. The FBI then has a National Gang Intelligence Center which filters through this and creates its own gang database, which is then circulated through something called the National Crime Intelligence Center. And that is an FBI center that every police agency throughout the country accesses and uses the National Crime Intelligence Center database. And they maintain a whole series of databases, but one of them is a list of supposed gang-affiliated members. Another is a list of supposed undocumented immigrants. Another is a list of known and suspected terrorists. So this is another way that ICE gets information from the Chicago Police Department, sometimes through the FBI, about this gang database, and then it becomes a pipeline to deportation. So you start to see the way that through this surveillance network that's created and the federal funding that comes with it, the deep connections between the ways that Arab and Muslim communities are targeted, Black and Latino communities are targeted. And so this is what we're trying to do with this project, and we're hoping that some of this stuff can feed into the organizing and be useful as communities are coming together to push back against some of these practices. Thank you.
We're like out of time for this section, so I want to call the other panels up. But as they come up, I want to say really quickly that. So as we were learning about all of these things, you're labeled as a gang member, and now watching your social media pages and your Twitter and your, all of that, running your place, and they can see that you're a gang affiliate and they'll pull you over and harass you and all of that. But just there are a couple really important, I think, potentially constitutional implications, legal implications that are issues with the database. One is that you're not notified when you're labeled as a gang member. Nobody is sending you an email or a text message like, hey, just want to let you know, identify that you were, it belongs to this or that faction, just FYI. That doesn't happen. You don't know that you're in this database until you go to court for, civil or criminal court, or when it's too late, when you're in deportation proceedings. And you have no way to challenge it. There's no purging of this database. And he said that 75% of Black males under 30 are on the SSL. But people, and these people that I've interviewed personally, have, I guess you can say, grown out of or aged out of, banging. Like the 40, 45, 46-year-olds, like, yo, I've moved on with my life, and I'm still being targeted and labeled and treated like a gang member. There's no purging process. You are in this database. You are labeled as a gang affiliate for life. And I know that there's a lot of inaccuracies in this database, and that's real. And no one should be inaccurately labeled as a gang member if they're not. But I also want to say, sticking to just having an abolitionist lens, that even if you are a gang member, so what? That doesn't mean that this database needs to exist, right? Because there are people out there who are in gangs, and there are still people, they're still human beings. That doesn't mean that it's justified or okay to target them and surveil them based on that designation. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it on to Alex. I'm on the panel.
Thank you. Hi everyone, my name is Alex. I'll stand real quick. My name is Alex. I'm a member of BYP 100 squad. And I will be moderating the panel for y'all. We've got about 40 minutes. We're going to talk about abolition and taking down white supremacy. The good stuff. But before we get started, I'm going to ask the panelists to just give a quick introduction, name, pronoun, what you organize around, and who you organize with.
Hello everyone, thank you for joining us here today. My name is Cosette. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And I'm with the Black Youth Project 100. And did you say one other thing? That's good.
My name is Tanya Unsueta. Pronouns are she and hers. I work with Mi Gente, and I'm a member of Organized Communities Against Deportations. Mi Gente is focused on Latino mobilizing, Latinx mobilizing around the country. OCAD is very much an anti-deportation, anti-criminalization, Chicago-based org.
And yes, my name is Kamal Walton. I'm a member of Critical Resistance, and we throw down to abolish the prison industrial complex, which includes imprisonment, policing, surveillance, and any punitive responses to harm and violence, and also try to support folks who are building up those alternatives and the communities that are resisting state oppression.
Okay, so y'all know with these questions, the first couple questions will just be about like setting context and like framing definitions, and then I'll give y'all a chance to sort of like talk with each other, finding overlaps between the things that we're discussing. So Tanya, my first question is for you. Can you tell us what is sanctuary and why do we need to expand it?
Okay. So I think sanctuary, I'm not gonna like go to the start of the like history of the word. In very recent context, I think the conversation around sanctuary has been centered around cities particularly that are supposed to be pushing back against the Trump administration, as Janae mentioned earlier. And I think so particularly after the Trump election, there was this wave of cities that were talking about being sanctuaries for immigrants. And I think one of the things that, we started talking a lot about was that it was really inaccurate, not just because it actually wasn't true in the immigration side, but also because it was just, I think, a big slap in the face towards like other people who are not immigrants, who are trying to be safe, who are being criminalized, who are being killed by police, who are being incarcerated. And I actually I didn't like the word sanctuary for a long time. It did feel like it was this empty word, right, that like everyone threw around, and that I'm not even like religious, so it didn't even like draw some of those connections. But I think the idea was that it was a tactic that at the moment was meant to move immigrant communities to think beyond ICE as a target and to think beyond themselves as the group of people that needed to be defended. And the reality was that a lot of immigrant communities did have, we want sanctuary as a main demand in our movement. And so I think it was capitalizing on some of that. Democrats, such as our mayor, Rahm Emanuel, talk about the city being a sanctuary, and so it was also about putting Democrats in a dilemma of like, you want sanctuary in our city, this is actually what it means. And so trying to like use some of their own messaging to move our stuff forward. And I think it was also trying to open doors for collaboration with particularly US-born Black folks, BYP 100 being one of the main groups that we've been able to work with, just because of like collective survival. So all of that to say, like, to us, the word sanctuary was something that was and probably still, I think we can make an argument that's strategic in terms of pushing Democrats and pushing our own immigrant rights movement to go beyond where we need to be. And just for mutual survival, it just like when we're talking about making our community safe, it has to be more than immigrants and it has to be more than ICE that we're talking about.
Thank you. And Kamal, now I have a question for you. What does abolition mean and what has it meant for your organizing?
Ooh, abolition. So yes, this is, I feel like Janae already like introed and broke it down in a really beautiful way, because this is something that BYP 100 has dug into really thoroughly, and one of the reasons why I'm such a fan. So basically in thinking about how folks at Critical Resistance, how some of our co-founders, and even the folks who are throwing down now think about abolition, it's a lot of both and. So one big part of it, when you think about abolition, is getting rid of some shit. And with us, we're talking about the prison industrial complex. And this is coming from a legacy of folks who worked to abolish slavery, from folks who are very aware of the prison industrial complex and the impacts of like spreading policing and the prison booms that happen and the ways that broken windows policing spread across the country. So it's both getting rid of imprisonment, getting rid of policing, getting rid of surveillance as a means of social control, as a means to respond to problems that are actually social, economic, and political issues. So it's getting rid of those things. That's one part of it. And it also means that our strategy needs to be broad enough to where we can build models today that show how we want to live in the future, while also chipping away at the life and scope of the prison industrial complex. And so it's not just about saying, let's get rid of the cops, let's get rid of the cages, but it's also about, in that process, so that we can build the alternatives that we need, making abolition make sense to people so that they can question policing, they can question imprisonment, they can question why so much surveillance is happening in our communities, and spark folks' imaginations to envision a world that looks drastically different and a world that they're actually willing to fight for. And so when I think about like the campaigns that I worked on in critical resistance, so I live in Atlanta now, but I came up in Oakland, thrown down with folks, and was a part of several campaigns. So one of them that I'm gonna talk about more later is the fight to abolish gang injunctions in Oakland. And I know y'all don't have them here, but it's basically like a tool that's used by the state to identify folks based on alleged gang affiliation. So it's oftentimes people who are in the gang databases in Oakland, as well as based on the neighborhood they live in, any previous convictions that they may have as an excuse to restrict and control people. So they'll have a list of like 40 people, and then a list with like 20 John Doe spaces where they might be able to add folks later. And everyone on this list in like 100 block radius, I guess. If you're on this list, you now have a curfew while you're in this neighborhood. You're not allowed to possess gang-related paraphernalia, and that could be a red t-shirt, that could be a felt tip marker. You can't talk to other people on the list, so if your cousin's on that list, you're out of luck. You can't communicate with other people on the list. And then if you do get caught up for some odd reason, like you're more than likely to experience a lot more like enhanced sentencing and punishment as a result of that. And so this is not only a tool of like controlling the people on this list, this was actively being used because we won and shut that shit down, but it was being used as a tool of gentrification. So all of the people on the list in North Oakland were black folks. And North Oakland is a place that's being heavily, heavily gentrified. All of the people who were put on the gang injunction list in East Oakland were Latinx folks. And that is an area that they're like really starting to come for now. And so the fight against the gang injunctions was not only to like get rid of them so we could get these folks off these lists and they could live their lives, but it was also a question of why do they think that we need more policing in our communities to make us safe? What is policing actually doing in our communities? Because it was pushing people out of North Oakland because they were like, I don't understand what this thing is. And in that campaign to fight for the gang injunctions, we also worked with folks who were actually on the gang injunction list to create community spaces, to have community events, block parties, do cultural work, and help folks to think about what the things are that will actually keep us safe. Yeah, and so a little bit of getting rid of some shit while also building up the common sense and making it make sense to our people that we don't need it and we want something else and we know what that something else is.
Thank you. And then Cosette, if you could, the last like definition that I'm going to ask for is if you could explain, if you could talk about invest divest and what it is and what it's meant for organizing in Chicago.
Yeah. So part of the work that we're doing is definitely highly community based, and it because they just go off. Sorry, y'all. So like invest, when we talk about invest, divest, This is like, it sounds simple on the outset, you know, it's a framework that believes that with investment in communities that we can see some of the issues that plague our communities decrease, and divesting from a lot of these punitive systems that impose, you know, not just these social costs on people, but also like these huge economic costs. Because a lot of the times when we talk about abolition, and we talk about like building these spaces that do not need police and do not need gang databases. A lot of response that we hear from folks when we're out in the community doing our street teaming, talking to folks about the gang database, talking to folks about deportation of Black and brown folks. Of course, there are some times where we hear pushback. Well, you know, I can hear shooting on my block. You know, there are gang members that terrorize the kids that are, you know, going to and from school. We hear a lot of these things from folks, and these are not things that, you know, we can just ignore. These are legitimate concerns from folks that live in different communities across Chicago. But if you look at some of the same communities that are dealing with some of these issues, they are also likely, they tend to be the communities that also see the least amount of investment from the state, the least amount of attention from the state, have the worst education systems, have very few to any resource and recreation centers, gyms. All of these things that we see in a healthy community are things that we tend not to see in the communities where violence and violent crime is at its peak. And so when we in BYP 100 think about what it means to you know, abolish the prison industrial complex and also to abolish police, we also have to think about, well, what's the next step in that? Are we abolishing police and then leaving, you know? And so, you know, if we are begging and asking people not to call 911, are we providing ourselves as that next person that they can call? Are we that new response? And a lot of that work definitely hinges on the way that we see the city budget is spent. So we know from a lot of the research that we've done through Fund Black Futures that 30% of the police budget, of the city of Chicago's budget goes towards policing. And then we have, and that's just the amount, that's millions of dollars that goes specifically towards police. But even outside of that, in the past few days, we know that a land purchase was recently approved for a cop academy for $95 million. And that $95 million sits outside of the 30% that already goes to police. And so if we think about, and then we all know the popularized statistic that, you know, sociologists look at third grade scores, and from that they determine how many prisons to build. So what if instead we saw third grade scores and we chose to build 10 more schools? Or what if we saw third grade scores and chose to build 10 more youth centers and direct all of that funding towards nonprofits that can offer this restorative justice type of treatment instead of this punitive treatment that also like imposes high costs on everyone. When we think about how much of our property taxes are spent actually on building prisons and feeding and clothing the folks that are in prisons, it would actually be not just, you know, in the heart of humanizing people who have dealt with this lack of investment and dealt with this lack of attention because of anti-Blackness and a lot of times Islamophobia. And a lot of these fears, but it would humanize them, but it would also impose less like economic cost on all of us if we looked more towards preventative measures. So what this means is looking at the budgets in our communities that we can control. One is tax increment financing, where we see that even though it's intended to be a fund used for blighted communities, the majority of it goes to the Loop and downtown and North Side areas, where South Side areas are still underinvested in, even with the formation of these TIF districts. So what does it mean as BYP 100 and other groups to say, no, we want to control this budget, no, we want to control the city budget, and as a way to abolish prisons and police, what does it mean to now take that money and invest in the changes in our community that will benefit us?
My next question is pretty open for the three of y'all. Given the definitions that we've heard of sanctuary, abolition, and invest, divest, what overlaps do y'all understand or like maybe see or feel like as you hear each other talking about like other organizations' works? What overlaps are there for folks who are trying to maybe understand these things separately, but also like build these three things together like in context with each other?
Yeah, I think overall, when building and organizing with folks in a wide variety of communities, there are oftentimes a lot of common themes when we think about what the needs are that we're hearing from folks directly, and you can oftentimes like see it in the demands too. And so I'm sure with everybody, I don't know in depth how folks have been throwing down, but I'm sure there's a part of it where you're like in conversation with community about what the things are that we actually need, and ideally all of these things are moving us towards more self-determination, and having the ability to define for ourselves what we need, how we're going to invest our resources, and how we're going to treat our people and grow our communities and create the healthy, safe, and thriving spaces that we actually need, and that we actually deserve, and that are actually owed to us, and that we will win one day. And so yeah, I think like when we're talking about conversations around safety and around sanctuary, when we think about what the things are that our communities need to actually be safe, there's a lot of conversation around stable and affordable housing. There's a lot of conversation around investment in education. There's a lot of conversation around investing in our young folks. I don't know how many people do work with young folks nowadays, whether they're high school students or in elementary school, but they carry so much, and the education system as it exists now, and I know in Chicago, looks way different than it did when we were young people. And so investing in young folks is a thing that I hear about in many organizing spaces. And I think the things are common because our oppressors are common. The things are common because our communities, most humans need some pretty standard things to survive, and because our eyes are focused on self-determination, our eyes are focused on survival, and so the things that we're demanding and the things that we're saying we want instead are oftentimes very in line. And might look or sound different based on geography, but I think those are like some of the common themes that I hear a lot is what are the alternatives, what do we want to see instead, and what are the things that are going to put the power back in our communities as opposed to like on other people who have this power not based on merit or connection, but based on other pre-existing privileges.
I think I wanted to say two things. One, that there's this dynamic in the city of Chicago and like inside City Council that we've been able to see a little bit with our work around trying to make the Welcoming City Ordinance this like sanctuary city policy, protect everyone, right? Like Janae was saying, instead of just like people without criminal records. And one of the things that's really clear is that the mayor is really good about pitting Black aldermen against Latino aldermen, like really good. In a way that like basically the story that we get from the mayor's office has often been, we're not moving because we're trying to like create peace, because Black aldermen want police and they don't like us moving on so many pro-immigrant stuff. And the pro-immigrant people are like, but we're being deported. So there's almost this just like communication that's happening through the mayor. And I know that there's so many problems with our Latino aldermen and with our Black aldermen, and not gonna go there necessarily, but just the way that I think that the way that our communities are pitted against each other is playing out in a very clear way at the city level, and from what I've heard at the state level as well. And actually, like, I think that our communities are being targeted in very similar ways by, if not similar, like the exact same agencies. And so to me, like, it's really, really clear that gangs and drugs are gonna be a thing and have a thing, right? Like, it's the reason why a lot of people are getting deported and incarcerated, and it's mostly Black and brown. So it's like gangs and drugs, incarceration and deportation. And at the national level, at least, the places that are the places that I think should be our targets, right, and the places where these attacks are coming from are the White House, the Department of Justice under Jeff Sessions, and sort of all of the stuff that comes under the criminal justice system, and law enforcement, and in particular, local police and immigration enforcement. And we really want people to start thinking about ICE and immigration as law enforcement. They're actually the largest police force, national police force in the country, whose only supervisor is really the President of the United States. And so, you know, there's, to me, like, gangs and drugs, incarceration and deportation, White House, Sessions, and law enforcement, like, are sort of things that encompass a lot of the fights that we're having, or that we should, I think, like, be focusing on. And the last thing I'll say is, I think, you know, I want to a little later talk more about the bigger campaign against the gang database that we have been running, right, and that's been working on coming up with some of the recommendations and working to figure out how we defend people too. But one of the things that's been really central has been like the abolitionist perspective and holding that as a value, and the invest divest frame and holding that as a value too. And I think the abolitionist perspective, because one, it's not something that immigrant rights organizations in Chicago are used to thinking about. I think our immigrant rights movement is a very reformist movement, and like the organizing has just kind of like stayed there. And so we wanted to be clear that entering this conversation, we were aiming to be abolitionist, and kind of like come in if you'd like, but this is what we're doing, and centering OCAD and BYP at the center of it. And then on the divest framework, the divest invest is, I just want to say that actually, like, as we're figuring out how to talk to our own people about like what happens when there's gangs outside my door, why wouldn't I call the police? The best answer I have found is this question of like, actually, like, how could we find other ways to invest in our communities that would reduce the crime, that would like give people other opportunities? And so I just find that it's like our people might not know the language and the wording for it, but I think that conversation of like, yeah, to me it's the best way to turn the conversation from safety means more police officers versus safety means getting investment in our communities.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. A lot of this is definitely community research, like actually seeing what folks have to say about this. And also what that meant like for us as like organizations working together, OCAD and BYP 100, it means like addressing some of those stereotypes that like are pushed like forth in society, and like addressing some of those discomforts within our partnership, and so that like when we go out into our communities and we talk about the gang database and we talk about some of the work that we're doing, we're able to address some of these like points of contention between Black and brown communities, like that deal with this question of criminality and deal with this like question of like taking jobs and bad immigrants, and like we're like, well, Rahm Emanuel wrote in 2013 that every year while he is the mayor, they will hire 1,000 more police officers. already this year there have been 958 police officers hired. And so, you know, we're sitting here arguing about jobs and the availability of jobs in our community and who's taking up what, when in reality the top is taking up all of these things. That also bleeds into, you know, the corporate sponsorship of surveillance. Geographic information systems, the guy mentioned that before, GIS. So what does it mean that Geographic Information Systems is partnering with Google, who gets our GPS data and is using all of that to track us wherever we go? What does this overt surveillance mean? A lot of the work that I did over this summer was tracking how much more investment in surveillance technology happens when a public housing complex is placed into a non-black or non-brown neighborhood. And like what I saw is that like streetlight cameras, the quantity of streetlight cameras shot up, the quantity of cameras in the area, the quantity of foot officers shot up in the area. And so is that really predictive policing? You are essentially assuming that because low-income folks are moving into a development in your neighborhood, that automatically means there's going to be crime. That is not predictive policing. That is anti-black, anti-brown policing. And so like a lot of these issues that overlap in our communities, they touch on these things. And so it gets at the root of it when we address these complex things.
Thank y'all for setting the context and like explaining those overlaps. I think that one thing that I really want to uplift, Kamal said, like our oppressors are the same. I think that that's really important, especially when we're talking about abolition, because like how I understand abolition is like it's the answer to like our oppressors being the same. Like it's the direct response, our direct response as Black and brown folks, like in organizing in these struggles. And so I just want to like uplift that and say thank y'all. My last question for the group, I think we have about 10 minutes left, is if each of you could explain or talk about some examples of abolitionist campaigns that you're working on right now or that you've been a part of or that you've seen to like give folks in the room some concrete like specific examples.
Yeah, sure, I can start. As far as abolitionist struggles, definitely this work that we're doing right now is like one of the largest like abolitionist struggles that we're doing. We're also working in coalition with other organizations against the Cop Academy, No Cop Academy. Like I said a bit earlier, that's the $95 million Cop Academy to be placed in North Lawndale. Really, really important considering that just a bit back, we had 53 schools closed in the south and west side of Chicago. But then you have a $95 million, beautiful Cop Academy being drawn up. So if you think about, invest, divest, and like what that means for that, there's that. And we also did a lot of work often around the city budget, especially last year, and that means like looking at this 30%. This actually in 2018 is going up to 31%. We're looking at this 30% amount that's being spent on policing and working on the Fraternal Order of Police contract. That kind of like is pushing the city, and that Rahm Emanuel has these relationships with the Fraternal Order of Police, which essentially is like the bank or union of CPD, and trying to make changes in that contract so that they do not have as wide of an ability to harass us the way they do. So those are some of the campaigns we've been working on. But like in all of the work that we do, I feel that it is all abolitionist work because it is all built like working towards a world where we don't need police and don't need prison. So all of this work is pretty formative.
I wanted to give a little bit of background on how particularly OCAD, Organized Communities Against Deportations, came into some of the gang database work real quick. So one of a family that is now a member, the family of Wilmer Catalan, Wilmer's house was raided by immigration enforcement, and I think in part because the ICE agents thought that because he was in the gang database, they targeted him, and I think they treated him a little extra bad because he was in the gang database, so he was already hurt. They hurt his arm, hurt his shoulder, treated him incredibly badly. And we didn't find out until later, like Janae was saying, that he was in the gang database and that the raid at his house was actually part of a national operation targeting suspected gang members, as you may have heard some of the Trump rhetoric boast. And so it was kind of through his case and through the cases of other people that we have seen that end up being raided that we started really digging into the conversation around the gang database. And then this idea around expanded sanctuary came, and OCAD had been building relationships with BYP 100 and Asada's Daughters and other Black-led organizations in Chicago. And so it sort of all came together into this thing that we're trying now of launching a campaign against a gang database that it's both abolitionist and that has an invest divest framework, and that is actually also focused on just getting Wilmer out of detention. And his case has given us a lot of access to information about the database. He's involved in a lawsuit, and it's been the willingness of his family, I think, to lend their story to this campaign and to speak out against it has been, I think, incredibly important and central to a lot of the work that we're doing. But I also wanted to say, so there's different set parts of the campaign. I think the research that was put out today and that you'll see is one of the important pieces. There's also folks working around city council and making sure that whatever policies we try to move forward in city council are also abolitionists, and that we figure out how to tear it down as opposed to make it stronger. There's some efforts around getting people to be able to find out their own information, file Freedom of Information Act requests to find out whether we're in the gang databases or not, and figuring out some strong movement and response around that. And I think at the same time using this campaign to push back and ideally weaken the mayor, especially as he tries to use immigrants as his sort of trophy, right, of look at all the good things that we're doing. And I think for us, this is part of weakening his power, empowering our communities, and actually I think getting some tangible things that improve our people's lives if we're able to get rid of the gang database.
Yes, so the first thing I want to say is I think these got passed around to folks, this chapter, or they're back at that table. So this is a chapter out of a book called Life During Wartime, Resisting Counterinsurgency, and a good chunk of folks that threw down around the campaign to fight the gang injunctions in Oakland helped to write that chapter collaboratively years ago, including myself and that little Jim over there, Jess Haney. Yes, and so that is one place where you can find out more about the specifics of the fight against the gang injunctions. So when we're talking about what abolition looks like practically, it's important to be clear about what an abolitionist reform is versus a basic liberal or neoliberal reform. So abolitionist reforms are basically things that we're not going to have to work ourselves out of in the future. They're not piecemeal things that are meant to pacify folks, but these are wins that are actually giving us a toehold to go up towards the next step of getting to where we need to be to abolish the prison industrial complex. And so one example that I always like to lift up, because it's really, really practical, but it's not one that Critical Resistance did, but I'll talk about more of our stuff too, is several years ago in San Francisco, there was a young Black man named Kenneth Harding Jr. who, I don't know if they do that here in Chicago, but in San Francisco, cops get on the buses and check to make sure that you paid. And so That's what was happening. He ran off of the bus, and over a $2 ticket, he got shot in the middle of the afternoon in broad daylight. And community organized, not only demanding justice for Kenneth Harding Jr., but they were also like, what do we need to do to make sure that this doesn't happen again? And in San Francisco, there was an ordinance that was passed, and now young folks who are in high school, ages 18 and under, or up to 19, I think now, are able to get free youth passes if they're low-income folks, so that they're not being put at risk of being shot down by the cops because they're too poor to afford a bus ticket. And so that's a very practical, like, abolitionist reform that happened. So it wasn't necessarily getting rid of all of the cops or stopping them from getting on the buses, but it keeps our young people out of the clutches of the police because we've gotten this avenue so that they can move a little bit more freely. We also do work around all types of things. I wrote a very partial list here, but the Abolitionist newspaper is one of the tools that we use not only to break down like what abolition looks like, but to amplify the voices of current and former prisoners and our allies. We have different themes. It comes out, I think, 3 times a year. There are copies in the back, and we send it to over 5,000 prisoners across the country. It's also an organizing tool, so we used it. It's in English and Spanish, and at least one of the issues has been translated into Arabic, I believe. And we have used it as an organizing tool to communicate with prisoners across the country, and specifically in California, when there were prisoner hunger strikes a couple of years ago, to like be in communication with people, collect information, give updates to folks. We also do a lot of work around Stopping Urban Shield, which is a police militarization training, and the work around that is not only stopping local agencies like police forces, fire departments, and things like that from participating, but it's also to stop the funding that is increasing militarization, not only in like the very tangible ways with our police, but also in the mentalities and how they approach folks in our communities. We concretely fight prison and jail expansion in a lot of sites across the country. There are folks in New York working to close jails. There are folks in LA working to fight jail expansion. And we also do things like Know Your Rights trainings. We do workshops around the prison industrial complex and what abolition actually is. If people want to hear like some other really dope examples of folks responding to harm and violence without using the police, you can check out a website called stopviolenceeveryday.org. And folks have their transcripts and also audio of people sharing their stories around that. And the other thing that I want to lift up is the Oakland Power Projects. And so that came out of, this was post-gang injunctions, and we wanted to be in conversation with the community about what we should be doing next. And one of the themes that came up in those interviews and conversations was during medical emergencies, folks would call 911 and the cops would show up, and oftentimes shit would just get worse. And so we worked with healers, medical professionals, a wide variety of very dope folks to not only do some political education with them as a cohort, but to also develop workshops that help people know how to respond during medical emergencies for folks with chronic illnesses, during drug overdoses, and during mental health emergencies, so that our folks actually have more tools and more options available to them, so that it's not just 911 or nothing. And we also try to like amplify the work of other people who are building out alternatives, so that we can do that really important piece of sparking folks' imaginations, because so often all that we know is what's being offered to us by the state, and in reality we could be doing and getting access to so much more, but we just don't know it.
Cool. That concludes our panel. I just want to send like tons of love and power and shout outs to y'all for all the dope work that y'all are leading within your respective organizations. So thank you. If y'all could just give them a clap. So the next part that we're gonna go into, if you notice on your name tag, you have a green, purple, or yellow sticker, and there are also there's 3 chart papers around the room. We'll have green folks over here, purple folks come up here and yellow folks back there. And we're gonna talk, so there's like two parts of this conversation. You know, what is the impact of policing on your community? We're gonna answer questions about how has gang policing come up in your organizing work or life? How have you seen policing strategies in Chicago change? And then the second part of that is, how are we gonna fight these things? What would expanded sanctuary require for you in your community? How can we move people towards more abolitionist frameworks? So again, green folks over here, purple folks over there, yellow over there. Does everybody have a copy of these questions? Yeah. Okay. And there will be those questions within your groups.
Somebody wrote a line. Okay, so we are going to do a real quick report back to hear from all these different groups about some of the noticings and some of the really dope ideas that folks had around either work that they've seen, work that they've dreamed, or work that they want to support around fighting against increased policing and the ways that it impacts our communities. So we're going to, do I remember the colors? Yes, I remember the colors. I'm going to randomly choose a color and then have folks come up and just give a little bit of a summary. And what we're gonna focus on is the piece that looks at the how are we gonna fight it. I feel like if we have time, maybe we will do the ways that we've seen policing impact our communities, but I feel like all of us are experts in those experiences, so we're just gonna look at the fighting it. Let's see, Purple Crew. Is there someone in your group that is down to break down a little bit of what y'all talked about around how are we going to fight the impacts of policing and surveillance and other things? No? I'm a facilitator that sits with silence, so I'm just gonna wait until I send somebody up. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Give it up for Will, y'all.
We looked at public education, that you can kind of have a combined approach of public education for marginalized people and vulnerable people, and public education for more privileged people, and kind of find people who are best situated for one or the other. And also a lot of art, putting up posters and other types of public art, and coming to public events where they make murals and things, and birthday parties and block parties, so you can kind of influence the culture. You can influence to make something like gang injunction a dirty word, so people hear gang injunction and they kind of associate it with something bad. And maybe we could do that with gang database. We could try and get people, when you say gang database, they're gonna think, oh man, that's something racist. And we also talked about occupying abandoned buildings, that if you could occupy an abandoned building, then you can make it a little center of resistance in a gentrifying neighborhood, and you can kind of undermine the argument that, oh, there's all these abandoned buildings, gentrifiers are going to come in and fix that problem, because the problem is not the abandoned building. The problem is that the community doesn't have resources it needs, and they can take the resources by taking the abandoned building, and that kind of fixes something. And we also talked about when you see the police stopping somebody, you can also stop and argue with the police and ask them why you stop that person, and if you could leverage your privilege in that way, if you have white privilege or something like that. And then you can also videotape to keep yourself safe, and maybe later on, if it could be used as evidence, if they want to sue the police for illegally stopping them.
Thank you, Purple Squad. And next we're gonna have, who is this over here? My group, yellow people. Where are we at? Bring your brilliance and your blackness to the front, please and thank you.
Something's standing on the other side of it. No, we're looking at just how
Hi, my name is Justin. I'm black. How are we going to fight police? So one of the suggestions was there was a program up north, the Swedish Covenant, and what they did was they dispatched mental health professionals instead of police, because a lot of times, like in crises that don't really need police, like medical crises, ambulances and stuff like that wouldn't arrive until the police show up, and the police weren't even needed in the first place. So that was one suggestion.
Another suggestion that we had was to require that people that are being put in these gang databases to be notified, be informed about it, and also to create a pathway for them to get off of it. And something else that we had was to talk with youth and to kind of hear what they're going through. A lot of them are already immersed in what's happening. It's not news to them. And so to kind of see what their thoughts are, what solutions they have, and kind of fighting back in terms of talking with them about restorative justice.
Another idea that was we talked about was just raising awareness and building a base around how the city's money gets spent. The city of Chicago spends about $50 million per year on police corruption, and that's outside of their budget, so that's not even talking about what they already, what their budget consists of, but we're talking about, every time they kill somebody, the police settlements and stuff like that come out of taxpayer dollars, it comes out of our pockets. And so one of the suggestions was raising awareness so that maybe we can build a campaign around demanding that when these type of situations happen, that settlement money, those $1 million settlements, come out of police pensions. That way they can they'll be more willing to hold each other accountable. Like, if you kill this person, if you don't stop and think about this, this is going to affect all of us, because it's coming out of these $1 million settlements are going to come out of all of our pensions, and maybe then there will be some accountability.
We have one more thing. This was to create, we talked about kind of a coalition, so using like the hubs that are already available to like clinics and communities, help to distribute, paperwork to them, pamphlets, brochures to help spread the word. And we even discussed utilizing churches as a way to alternatives to policing. Maybe church can be an area to respond instead of the police.
Thank you. And then the last group, which was back over here, I think. Whoever wrote in purple. Oh, okay.
I think I was a bad moderator and didn't pick someone to do this.
So we talked about a couple of different things, but I'll mention rapid response alternatives to 911 or to emergencies that are, I think people mentioned both like community-based, and we could spread the word on our own, and then like possibilities of making them actually part of like the city's 911, etc. conversation responses. A lot of talk about how we can use parks and schools. A specific recommendation was, can we make parks and schools open 24/7? Can we analyze the opportunities and programs that exist in different parks, and basically demand that there are activities for communities and that those are funded. And there was also the conversation of just like the emphasis on how do we limit the presence and authority and lift up, I think, both people's imaginations and people's possibilities in our minds, that there can be alternatives and that we sort of like deserve more and not normalize some of the police violence. Other people were better at this, but.
All right, thank you everybody for taking a minute to really think and assess like what are all the different ways that we could be fighting back and pushing back, especially because like the 4 of us that were up here are folks who are experts in the stuff we throw down on, but you are experts as well. And a key piece of abolition is knowing that we know what we need. And so it's really dope to hear everybody's ideas. Some of the themes that I saw were the importance of connecting with community, so thinking about like what the community hubs are, where are the places where we could be spreading information, what are the opportunities to engage with folks that are being impacted. Sharing information, there was some mentions of like looking at the privileges and access that you have and thinking about how you can leverage that for more marginalized folks or more heavily impacted people. Thinking about like what public spaces and what resources we already have access to and how those can be sites of contention and ways to fight. And I think overall, like one of the major themes in thinking about this is not only how we're fighting back against this thing, but also that we have a lot of resources, we have a lot of brilliance up here, and so it's important to think about the ways that we can push to actualize that stuff, because it doesn't matter whether it's whether we're talking about people on a gang database or not on a gang database, whether we're talking about people that are documented or undocumented, whether we're talking about people who have done something that was defined as criminal or not. We're not talking about innocent versus guilty. We're talking about our communities. We're talking about people who look like that, who look like us, who are our friends, who are our family, who are people that we care for, and fighting against a system that is designed 100% to decimate our communities, that is working fully as it was designed to, and so we need to meet that head on and think about the ways that we can organize as broadly and as fiercely as possible to protect and defend our people. So thank you everybody for like bringing your ideas. Oh, yes, and then there are more places to bring your ideas. Ayo. So tomorrow there is going to be another event. As y'all know, this is a series of events according to the brilliant art on the walls and the folks who have spoken previously. So on Saturday, tomorrow, there is an event called Fight to Win, Shrinking Prisons and Jails and Strengthening Communities, and that's going to be at the Trinity United Church of Christ from 12 to 2. So Saturday, tomorrow, 12 to 2, you can come kick it with a lot of the people who are already in this room. And then Sunday, there's a organizers roundtable discussion at the Chicago Freedom School, and that's from 12 p.m. to 2:30 p.m. And we'll have some coffee and light brunch food if you're feeling a little hungry. And if y'all want more information about this and you're not sure where to find it, you can just take a picture of it. Yes. Is that
Hand it over.
I think I'm supposed to say the thank you, but that's it.
Oh, okay, well, you can do that. Yeah, because you didn't left, right? No, yeah, okay. So just as a closing, wanted to say thank you particularly to Critical Resistance and BYP 100 and OCAD, who really put together this conversation. I think just in terms of next steps, really like a lot of this is a call to action. Like we're still doing, these campaigns are ongoing, particularly here in Chicago. We have a court hearing with Wilmer Catalan, whose case I mentioned earlier, who's still in detention, who's still suing the city of Chicago over him being in the gang database. And so checking out like OCAD and the work there is super important. And then we're still doing the campaign against the gang database in Chicago. I think it's very much at the beginning, and like the release of the study actually is like a huge step forward for us. So I think there's lots of work and very concrete stuff to do both at the community level and at the grassroots level and at the education level, and then as in the mobilization piece and in pressuring our actual city council to be able to get some of the solutions that we want. So if you're not already a part of some of these groups that are organizing, I think the ask is like join us, whether it's like joining one of the organizations or making your organization take a look at the gang database campaign that we're working on and seeing how we can work together on this. So I think that's it. Thank you, guys.